Paulogia, and another edition of Ham and Egg News, where we react to Ken Ham reacting to things. And we're in luck, because Ken himself has finally returned for a now rare appearance on Answers News.
You've been here. I've been out for some medical reasons, and you've been traveling.
I've been traveling, been to Australia and back.
Like a boomerang.
The A-team is back,
Yep.
and they called us the Originals.
The Originals.
I like that.
I like that. That's
the
good.
Originals.
The classics.
The original.
That makes me feel nostalgic for the very first Answers News, with Ken, Georgia, and Bodie all jammed into what seemed to be a Creation Museum closet.
And we call it Answers News.
Next time we do this, we should do it in black and white.
Somebody said the classics like the Three Stooges.
Ken may not realize that's not a compliment.
Glad to see the original gang. Mr. Ham looks older. Laugh out loud.
Yeah, well, that's true. I am older than I was the last time I was here. That is a true scientific statement.
Well, we all are.
Yeah,
That's right. I'm
Pretty
older,
sure.
too.
Hey, wanted to mention we have an Easter conference coming up.
Answers in Genesis has conferences almost every week. You don't want to hear about that. Instead, let's hear about the convention I have coming up in June.
Hey, my friends.
I've been talking about some prolific spoilers.
Welcome.
She'll be
It's
there.
going to be an incredible
It's a whole
conference.
lineup.
So people
Great
can link
lineup.
to that, find information. Then
Yep.
one more thing before we go to genetics, and that is jobs.
We're still plugging things? What else do I have? I'm hoping to start a new video series called Ask Paulogia, where I do short clips responding to audience questions on Christianity or atheist-themed topics. But for that to happen, I'm first going to need some questions. You can submit yours by leaving a comment on any of my videos, as long as you include the hashtag AskPaulogia, or ask the question via Twitter, also with the hashtag AskPaulogia. I look forward to seeing what you're curious about.
Well, a lot of people are watching today, and they can't wait for the first two articles on genetics.
Oh, genetics. I know something about that. That'll be interesting.
Hi, Garte. Wow, it's great to have you here. Have you been waiting in the back the whole time?
Very impatiently.
Well, you are a geneticist, so this is great timing. Maybe tell everyone a little about your work.
Well, my doctorate degree is in biochemistry. I've worked in molecular biology as a research scientist for many years. I know a little bit about genetics, maybe a little bit more than a little bit, and I'm very interested in how genetics is used and misused by people who have religious and political viewpoints.
To be clear with the audience, you actually also have your own religious viewpoint on this.
Yes, I am a Christian. I am not a young earth creationist, however, and I do accept evolution in all of its precepts and ideas, and I'm very excited about evolution as a science. And I find some of the approaches to science taken by AiG and their friends to be not only bad for science, but pretty bad for Christianity as well.
Well, we're on the same page there. This is great. This is a great opportunity because I don't know nearly as much about genetics as you do. So should we take a look and see what Georgia has to say?
Let's hear it.
All right.
All right, so our first article on genetics is Genome Stability, Intricate Process of DNA Repair Discovered. And so what this covers is, so when DNA is in the nucleus and it breaks, so there's like a double-stranded break, which means both strands obviously break apart. They thought that the DNA just sort of floated around, I guess, until it found these repair enzymes and repair mechanisms to be able to fix it. Well, to their surprise, because they probably believe in evolution and that the cell is really simple, they actually found that this is a very, very complex process.
That's interesting. I have never met or known of or read about any biologist of any kind who ever thought that anything in biology or evolution was simple. So I don't know who the they is that is being referred to, but it's certainly not an evolutionary biologist.
What happens is there's these little liquid droplets of have DNA repair proteins in them that sort of go around the double-stranded break, and they get bigger and bigger, and then finally it's like a spider web that sort of sends out these like web parts to hook them to highways in the cell, microtubules, that then pulls it along so it goes to the DNA hospital in the nucleus of the cell where it's fixed.
In your view, is this sort of a accurate representation of the paper? Is it?
It's not wrong. It's a good representation for lay people. Well, it's funny because double-strand breaks in DNA was something I studied 20 years ago when I was looking at DNA repair and mutations in general. it is a tough problem because double-strand breaks are very difficult to repair by the normal enzymes that are used in DNA repair. Because once you have a double-strand break, the two strands of DNA, separate. So how do you get them back together to fix them? And the answer is this kind of thing, which is basically a droplet, although it's not liquid, it's not a water, it's a droplet of a protein enzyme, a very large enzyme complex, which does a lot of things, including, sending out all kinds of filaments. I mean, what she describes is more or less right, and brings the two strands together so that they can be repaired. So that's very nice. I don't see the relevance to creationism. There are some beautiful mechanisms in cellular biology that are highly complex, just the way we make proteins. So I'm not sure why this is special or why it's,
As I interpret it, this isn't repairing mutations per se. This is repairing breakage.
It's repairing breakage. And what happens when you repair breakage, you often get a mutation because the repair is not perfect. Repair enzymes don't have high fidelity. So now with a DNA double-strand break, I think that can also happen. But all kinds of DNA damage occurs. 98% of it is repaired properly, and a small percent is not.
And these mutations would be basically unimportant as long as they weren't in the gamete, right? They would have nothing to do with the next generation.
They would have nothing to do with the next generation, but they are important in that is the mechanism by which chemicals and radiation cause cancer. They cause DNA damage, which is then repaired. And if there's faulty repair, it's called error-prone repair in some cases. Bacteria would rather make a bad repair than no repair. So there's an error-prone repair system that comes up. And in mammals, those errors can be, carcinogenic mutations.
That doesn't necessarily imply design, but we'll save that for another day.
Oh, there's a lot that doesn't imply design.
It's so complex. How could that evolve by chance random processes?
Yeah. Well, what did the cell do in the meantime? I mean, how did it fix this stuff?
Until the repair mechanism evolved. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
Well, cells can survive with broken DNA for quite a while. And if the system works well and efficiently, the DNA is repaired pretty quickly. The only time you need DNA is when you're dividing or when you're transcribing, genes. You can have a pause on that for quite a while while you fix things. So
there are precursors to this that one could imagine.
There are not only precursors, there are other mechanisms for double-strand break repair, which are very error-prone, but they do exist. And those have been known for a long time.
Okay, I have a theological question for you.
Oh, no. Okay.
Okay. Did God create living things with a repair mechanism knowing they would need it in a fallen world, or is it part of the perfect world before the fall because things are just kept going perfectly?
Even UV light can cause DNA to mutate or change. So even in a pre-fall world, they would have been exposed to those things. But they worked perfectly back then, right? These repair mechanisms worked perfectly, so they never had mutations, they never had problems.
So the question itself is very odd to ask a scientist. And I don't know any other scientists who would even answer that question, because one thing about science is that it doesn't apply to theological questions. So the whole concept of asking whether a DNA repair system would work in a fallen or a pre-fallen world is just something that just makes no sense to ask. This shows you the problem when you have a scientist whose science is totally tied up with her theology, and the science part of it is not independent of the theology. Now, her comment is very strange because she's claiming that in a pre-fallen world where everything was perfect, DNA repair would also be perfect, and there would be no mutations as a result of DNA repair. The problem with that is, why would there even be DNA damage in a pre-fallen world if everything was perfect? The idea of having a DNA repair mechanism that is perfect is something that is scientifically not tenable. So again, this is an issue where you're mixing your theology and your science, and it's just like mixing politics and science. It really doesn't do well.
Once they were able to look inside the cell, they saw how intricate it was, and a lot of people have described it as like a miniature factory. I mean, this is more like a little miniature city.
Oh,
not just a factory. I mean, it's just a factory and cities all built in together.
Which kind of contradicts the assertion before that people didn't think that cells were complex earlier.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, next article. Genes from scratch, far more common and important than we thought. So what evolution needs is the ability to make new genetic information. Because if you're going to go from one kind of organism to another kind of organism.
Right, like a single-celled organism to a dog, you're going to have to add information.
You got to add. You can't just tweak what's already there. Okay, you're going to have to add new genetic information.
Right.
So the question has always been, well, how do you do that?
So this is one of the most central pseudoscientific claims made by young Earth creationism, which is that new genetic information is impossible. It cannot be done through mutation or natural selection or the combination of the two. I've tried to figure out how that claim has been posited and how it's been supported, and I can't find it because it's just simply demonstrably false. New information is continually being generated in many, many species. We know the mechanisms, which include gene amplification and gene duplication, and I wish they would drop it because it's just, as I said, demonstrably untrue. Another continuous error that you hear from this group is that evolution doesn't explain the origin of life. And how do you explain the origin of life? I had this very frustrating conversation with Kent Hovind on a debate once. Evolution, for example, does not say that one animal turned into another. It doesn't say anything about the origin of life. It doesn't say anything about the geological record of the Earth. It doesn't say anything about the age of the Earth. It's a biological theory. And the truth of the matter is that evolution and abiogenesis are two completely separate things. They don't work by the same mechanism. They can't. Darwin himself knew that this was not part of his theory, even though he knew nothing about molecular genetics, but he knew that the origin of life was a separate question. It would also be very helpful if young Earth creationists could learn that when we speak about evolution, we're talking about the diversity of life after its origin. There are people doing research into the origin of life. They are not using biological evolution to do so.
And from an evolutionary perspective, they haven't appeared before. Mm-hmm. So how could they be generated? But wait a minute. What about how did life get generated in the first place?
Their expectation that every scientific paper talks about abiogenesis, would that be analogous to saying that every article about sociopolitical climate in the States should also talk about how the United States was formed?
That's a good analogy. And another good analogy is every paper in physics should talk about what happened before the Big Bang, which nobody knows.
Right.
But then it says, well, others give significant advantages. Well, they might, like you think about antibiotic resistance in bacteria, but that's not causing it to move to another type of organism.
Right,
that's not the type
that's not really developing new orphan genes, if you will.
Right.
This is fascinating because what Dr. Purdom was just saying is that she's denying that there's any mechanism that could explain evolution from one species to another, but the whole point within evolution of how a new feature like an orphan gene can arise is that you have a process that produces what the feature is, and then natural selection comes in and fixes it in that population. That doesn't mean it's become a new species. What they always do is they think that the only thing we talk about when we talk about evolution is the formation of new species. No. She was correct about saying that this is what happens when a bacterium gets a resistance to an antibiotic. Yes, that's a mutation followed by natural selection, and the selection is very, very strong. It's the fact that every other germ around it is dying, and this one isn't. So, that's the epitome of natural selection. And ironically enough, the current model of AiG for how we have the flora and fauna that we have is that after the flood, the animals from the ark spread out throughout the world and, wait for it, they evolved. The original cat kind actually evolved into lions, tigers, and pussycat. And how did they do that? Through natural selection. So, they're not that far from really understanding the scientific basis of evolution. They don't want to admit that it was evolution because they define that as one kind turning into another kind, which of course is not what anybody says. But what they have done is sort of conflate this idea of natural selection, the acquisition of new genotypes leading to new phenotypes, which is exactly what orphan genes are. And they've conflated this with changing species, and it has nothing to do with that. In fact, we know it doesn't, because the orphan genes, as she correctly said, are restricted to one species. They don't go to other species. So if they did, they wouldn't be an orphan gene by definition. So, it has nothing to do with the issue of what they call macroevolution, which is the development of speciation. What it has to do with is natural selection and improvement of some population within that species that then takes over.
In your words, what is this paper presenting? What new information is this paper excited about?
Well, this paper follows in a long line of papers. I don't know how far back, because I heard of orphan genes when I was still working actively. I might mention that the word orphan is a pun, because what it comes from is there's a part of a gene called an open reading frame, which is abbreviated ORF in capital letters. And when people found open reading frames, I won't go into the technical definition of what that is, but it's part of a gene. And so they found these things, but they couldn't tell where they came from. So somebody very clever, I don't know who, of course, thought of calling them orphans. And the original word was capital ORF, lowercase an. And that was very amusing.
Science humor. You guys are so clever.
Yeah, we really are. When these were first discovered, it was felt that they were very rare and were not really like real genes. They were just sort of strange fragments of DNA that somehow could code for something, maybe. That has been progressively changed. More and more are being found. They're actually far more common than we thought. There are now some good models and hypotheses, really, for how they could arise, and some have been found.
Well, and they're trying to say, well, maybe some of this maybe these new genes came from junk DNA. Well, the thing is,
Right, like
junk DNA,
cousin genetics,
yeah,
if you
it's
will.
a bad name for it, because that DNA in between the genes isn't just doing nothing, it's doing something, and it's really, really important. So you just see them sort of grasping for straws all throughout this article, because they don't understand where these genes come from.
So that's very interesting, because she actually gave part of the answer. And her comment about junk DNA is just thrown in there because young Earth creationists do not believe that there is any junk DNA. And the question of whether there is any DNA that serves no function whatsoever is still open. There have been a lot of recent studies, one of which quite famous by a group called ENCODE, that found that maybe 80% of the DNA actually does have a function. That's been hotly contested. But it may be true that it shouldn't be called junk DNA. It may be just, that's a slang term, obviously. It's not technical. So she's putting in the fact that we shouldn't call it junk DNA because I guess the theology is God would not create junk. And in fact, what it looks like is that, yes, many of these orphan genes probably come from those regions of DNA that don't seem to have any function. They're leftover segments of dead genes, of viruses, all kinds of garbage, which the cell doesn't get rid of. So she gave one of the answers for one of the ideas of where these orphan genes come from.
For someone like myself, would it be better for me to say non-encoding rather than junk DNA? Is that a better phrase?
Well, non-coding DNA includes a lot of things like regulatory sequences and retrotransposons and things like that, some of which have function of some degree. So I think non-functional is probably the best. Yeah, that's the best term.
Okay, cool. That's what I will use.
When they started looking at that, they assumed most of them would come from something like that. And when they looked, they're like, okay, there's a lot of genes that don't look anything like others.
2/3 of them don't,
Yeah, 2/3. So they were like, okay, well, those must have just been de novo emergence genes. They just say
The
it.
point is well taken that where these orphan genes come from is not known, and it's an area of active research. How do we know that these genes aren't related to any other genes? And that would mean that there's part of their sequence which is the same as either other genes or other parts of the DNA. And how we know that one stretch of DNA has some similarity to another stretch of DNA is by doing a computer analysis called a BLAST. And that is a combination of search engine and statistical analysis developed a long time ago, which enables you to take any stretch of DNA and see if there's anything like it somewhere else. Now, when we find a sequence of DNA that we can't find any homologue or any similarity to anything else, that's considered a new de novo or orphan DNA. They didn't come from, magic. I mean, let's put it that way.
But were you there?
Sometimes I'm old enough, I feel like I was.
And we're not observing it. We don't see it.
Right.
That was the one thing that I gathered. After reading this, I'm like, okay, if we observed any of this, we're not. We're not observing orphan genes being made.
When I made that joke, I didn't realize Bodie was actually going to go there.
All right. Kids learn about animals evolution during Darwin Day at Discovery Science Place.
You know what they're really telling these kids? Oh, look at these wonderful animals and Darwin and evolution. It's all true. Kids, there's no God. Everything came about by natural processes. Life is purposeless and meaningless. Isn't this great? Let's celebrate.
Not speaking as a geneticist, but as a scientist in general, I don't believe that anyone is telling kids that life is meaningless and purposeless and isn't that great. Nor should they be telling, maybe a few do, but should they be telling anyone that evolution shows that there's no God, etc. So I think Ken Ham is somewhat exaggerating in that comment.
Creationists seem to always think that Darwin is still an authority figure in this field.
That's a good point. In fact, he's not. I'm not in evolutionary biology, but I have several friends who are, and they are all very clear. Everybody says, no, Darwin is a very interesting historical figure, but evolution is no longer Darwinism. It's evolved. It's gone way past that. So the idea of attacking Darwinism is kind of silly.
Somebody there said, science doesn't rob us of the emotional joy of celebrating life. I'm like, yes, it does.
The idea that science robs us of the joy of celebrating life is not only nonsense, but it's completely anti-Christian. Think back to all the scientists who were celebrating the joy of life with people who, worship Christ and did science because they felt it was understanding God's creation and they got great joy out of it and still do. So that comment is astonishing to me. I actually have not heard anything like that before, that science robs us of any joy of any kind. And for a Christian to say that, to me, I think it's anti-biblical, frankly.
Darwin Day is celebrated annually around the world on the birthday of biologist Charles Darwin, who is known for his scientific theory of evolution and natural selection. First off, was Charles Darwin a biologist?
No.
No, he was actually a
theologian.
Yeah.
So I looked this up because the idea that Darwin is not a biologist, it's kind of like saying that Copernicus was not a physicist. I mean, because the word didn't exist. So the word biology was coined in 1802 and biologist was used, but it didn't mean what it means today. The first time it was ever used to mean someone who studies the science of life was way past the origin of species. Yeah, Darwin didn't call himself a biologist. He called himself a natural historian, which in those days included geology, biology, zoology, everything was all mixed in. So to say he was not a biologist, he was kind of the inventor of modern biology. So yeah, I mean, you could put it that way. Edison was not a light bulb engineer, right?
Right.
He invented the light bulb. So that's ridiculous. And I do know a little bit about the life of Darwin, and I know that he was sent to divinity school, which he hated. And he refused to become an active pastor. So to call him a theologian is really a stretch.
I remember the word scientist also was similarly around like 1830s.
Yeah, that's right. Even after scientist was used, the word was natural philosopher until almost the end of that century.
Right, which is why people who have science doctorates now are PhDs, right?
Yeah, exactly. All knowledge is philosophy.
Now, is this a scientific theory, observable, repeatable? No. A theory, maybe an idea or a hypothesis, but it's definitely not a theory.
It's actually an odd time to correctly identify what a theory might mean.
I'm very happy to hear that they're not saying it's only a theory. It sounds like actually they have learned the idea of what a theory is, which is a body of knowledge, including facts and quantitative and qualitative reasons behind those facts that tie in with other facts. So that's good.
And when someone wants to insist that science is repeatable, would it be fair to say that the measuring is the part that we repeat not necessarily the event.
Absolutely. When you talk about evolution being repeatable, what you mean is somebody made an observation that all of the fossils that are older are further down in the ground. Now, okay, maybe they made that observation in Arizona. So now to repeat that, you would dig a hole in China and see if you get the same result. That's repeatability, okay? That's repeatability of measurement, as you said. When these people are using repeatability, I don't know what they're talking about, but I think they're talking about we can't, turn a cat, or as Kent Hovind likes to say, we can't turn a pineapple into an elephant reproducibly, right? I mean, that whole differentiation between observational and historical science is nonsense. I worked at one part of my career with epidemiologists who study how diseases are started, how they spread, etc. And this is historical science. I mean, you look at what happened, and then you come up with hypotheses and test them and see if they're correct. But you don't repeat it. Well, I guess nowadays we're thinking about flu viruses, so you don't take the flu virus and say, well, let's see if it kills more people now like it did before and infect a bunch of folks and see what happens. No, so there's no border, there's no boundary between historical and observational science. It's kind of like the kind problem in definitional terms. It doesn't have any meaning.
Yeah.
They jump from their belief that one kind changed into another.
This idea that one kind turned into another is, I guess, my favorite pet peeve, because one kind or one species or whatever you want to call it never turns into another. That's critical to understand evolution. You can't have evolution if sometimes a cat turns into a goat or an elephant turns into whatever. Evolution depends on exactly the claim they're making that different kinds of animals don't turn into other kinds of animals. I have made this point, and it goes right over the heads of the people I'm talking to in this area. So I don't know what else to do, but it's something that's really worth everyone understanding. Dogs only give birth to dogs. Cats only give birth to cats. People only to people, and on and on. This betrays a complete ignorance of the real meaning of evolution. There is no claim of any animal ever turning into any other animal ever.
Think about what that foundation leads you to. It leads you to survival of the fittest. It leads you to eugenics. It leads you to all these horrible things that we really don't want in our society.
Mm-hmm. So the idea that social Darwinism comes directly from evolution is an old one. There may be some truth to that some people used some of the precepts of natural selection, misunderstood, of course, to argue for things like eugenics. But that's what you call a really old slander that by this time is just, it's time to put it to bed.
Everything works together in a system. The ants are a good example of that. Hey, would they say the same thing about bed bugs?
Yeah.
Or coronavirus?
Although I find the same things true when I get the look at the trees arguments for God, where it's like, look at all the wonderful things. I rarely find that anyone says, look at the termite.
Oh, actually, looking at termites is a great way to see God. Termites are incredible. If you're a termite. Not if you have a wooden house, then they're not so good.
And we offer camps here to educate kids called Explore Camps. We're going to put a link here in the comments so you can see that, where your kids can come and experience science from a biblical creation worldview.
So the whole idea of saying science from a biblical creation worldview is terrible. And I'm speaking as a Christian. Because science should be viewed from a scientific worldview. And creation can be viewed from a theological, spiritual worldview. But science, as I said before, should be free of religious, political, social, or any other influence. And that's violated by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways, not just young earth creationists, but, even people in sociology or in politics or on the left and the right. I used to work in environmental science as a researcher, and that was a big struggle because, environmental science is a fairly political field. And it was always a problem to do scientific work that was purified from outside political influences. Put your theology outside the door of the lab, and then you walk in. I mean, that's a standard phrase.
So check out those camps.
Hey,
We're out of time,
I know we're out of time.
And Ken has called it. We're done and off the hook.
Okay. It's been fun. Yeah.
Way better than any of those Christian channels you go on.
This is going to be a high point.
Well, the honor has been mine. I'm so pleased when people of different faiths are willing to stand with me to affirm science and the idea that truth has nothing to fear from learning. Cy has a new book out called The Works of His Hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. Available now at Amazon, in the link in the description. And as soon as this video is done, you should hop over to Cy's new YouTube channel, also linked in the description, where he provides insightful tutorials on many topics in the field of genetics and biology. Thank you so much to my patrons, who literally make this channel possible and are helping me to spend more of my time on it. If you support what I do here, and are willing and able to join them, please find the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, later.